The chamber was thick with incense, but it could not mask the other smell. Scorched meat and royal blood boiling in real time. Shadows danced on the stone walls, cast by flickering candlelight and rising steam. In the center of the hall stood a cauldron, massive, blackened, hissing. Around it, nobles in embroidered silks stood paralyzed, their faces drained of all color, their eyes fixed not on the flames, but on the figure thrashing inside. He had once worn a crown. Now, his flesh peeled in sheets as screams burst from his blistered throat. His voice cracked, not from fear, but from betrayal. No executioner wielded a blade. No trial had passed. Only the fire spoke, and the fire did not lie. The question echoed louder than his screams. What could a king have done to deserve this? And more chilling still, who wanted them all to watch? This was not justice. It was a message. Before the screams, before the boiling blood, there was silence. A silence cultivated through terror. He was not born into gentleness. From the beginning, the boy who would become king learned that mercy was a weakness and fear a crown. Raised in a court riddled with whispers and daggers, he studied betrayal like scripture. And when his father died, some say poisoned at supper, the young prince took the throne with ice in his veins. To the people, he was a monarch chosen by divine will. To his court, he was a storm held barely in flesh. His rule began with feasts and proclamations, but they quickly gave way to disappearances. Nobles who once laughed beside him vanished overnight. Servants tiptoed in terror. Even his advisors, hand-picked and bound by oath, learned to speak only in guarded tones. Underneath the golden surface of power, he built a kingdom of dread. Secret dungeons bloomed beneath the palace, cold, damp chambers where loyalty was tested with iron and fire. His court became a heater of paranoia. No one knew who the spies were, only that they were everywhere. He did not forgive. He did not forget. A slight comment at a banquet could end with a public flogging. A delayed bow could mean exile. He ruled not through law, but through watchful silence. A presence that infected every hallway, every breath. And yet, behind closed doors, he feared shadows of his own making. He ate only from sealed dishes. His wine was poured by a mute boy with no tongue. Guards stood outside his bedchamber, but he slept with a dagger tucked beneath his pillow. The more he controlled, the more loyalty turned brittle. The more fear he sowed, the more it strangled trust. His kingdom was not built to last, only to obey. He believed himself immortal in power, untouchable in his cruelty. But even kings who carve their legacy in blood forget that blood boils. And someone was watching, waiting, holding the match. The halls of the palace were never quiet, but the noise had changed. Gone were the lavish songs of loyalty and celebration. Now came footsteps measured, voices hushed, eyes constantly shifting. Where once nobles laughed and dined in comfort, now they drank in silence, eyes watching every movement across gilded tables. It began as small things: a missed salute, a letter sealed too tightly, an envoy delayed without excuse. The king noticed, of course. He always noticed. But suspicion alone could not halt what had begun. His iron grip had finally started to crack, not from an outside force, but from within the very walls he trusted most. The first seeds of treason grew in the minds of those who had once stood beside him. Lords who had pledged blood loyalty now questioned if that blood was worth spilling for a man who no longer saw them as allies, but as threats. Behind closed doors and candlelight, murmurs thickened like smoke. Lady Ameline, once the king's favor, the consort and political ally, had not been seen in weeks. Some said she'd been sent away for daring to speak against a punishment too cruel. Others whispered she was buried in the very dungeons she once decorated. Lord Ventris, head of the Royal Guard, began leaving court early, always citing patrols, but never returning with reports. His brother had disappeared under the king's suspicion the year prior. Now, Ventris spoke carefully and watched even more carefully. The court became a stage where no one spoke their truth. Smiles widened while eyes narrowed. Toasts were raised with poisoned thoughts. Every noble donned a mask, not of gold, but of survival. The most dangerous change was this. No one felt loyalty anymore, only fear, and when fear becomes unbearable, it mutates into something far more unpredictable. And still, the king ruled as if nothing had changed, as if his crown was carved from eternity. But his court was no longer his. It was a silent machine, ticking slowly toward revolt. He didn't hear it, but the fire was lit, and it would not whisper for long. The king sat high above the crowd, robed in crimson and trimmed with black mink, a vision of imperial grandeur. Yet what unfolded beneath him was anything but noble. A young noble, barely a man, knelt in chains, accused of a minor offense whispered by a jealous rival. No trial, no defense, just judgment. The courtyard was flooded with onlookers, courtiers in bejeweled collars, priests holding their crosses, servants with trembling hands. In the center stood a platform, and on it, the boy. The king commanded silence with a single lifted hand. Then he gave the order. What followed was horror carved into memory. The boy's clothes were stripped, his dignity stolen before the eyes of those who once protected him. The execution wasn't swift, it was theater. The instruments were crude, the punishment dragged, turning justice into a ritual of pain. People watched, froze. The queen turned her face. A bishop lowered his eyes. No one spoke, not out loud, but hearts cracked quietly. A few wept, most clenched their jaws. The boy didn't scream at first. He tried to be noble, to die with dignity. But as the pain deepened, as flesh was broken and blood painted the stones, his screams became unbearable. He begged, not for his life, but for it to end. And all the while, the king watched, unblinking. Afterwards, the silence was heavy. The scent of blood clung to the marble. The sun seemed ashamed to shine. That night, the court did not gather for supper. Whispers traveled faster than servants. That boy had been innocent. The punishment had been personal. Cruelty, once accepted, now felt contagious. Even loyal nobles began to feel the sting of proximity. If it could happen to him, it could happen to any of them. In hidden chambers and quiet corners, the real conversations began. No more masks, no more excuses. They didn't use the word rebellion. They used words like balance, justice, cleansing. And for the first time, those words didn't feel treasonous. They felt necessary. The king believed he had sent a message that day. He had, but not the one he intended. The castle grew quieter in the weeks that followed. Not peaceful, but tense, like a held breath. Whispers passed between tapestries. Glances lingered longer. The courtiers still bowed, still smiled, still played their roles, but something invisible had cracked. It began with silence. Loyal voices stopped praising. The king noticed. Then, absences. Nobles suddenly ill, foreign emissaries delaying visits, old allies requesting distance. But beneath that calm surface, a conspiracy churned. Small at first, a disgraced advisor invited back for a private supper. A merchant's son offering poisons instead of spices. The threads began to pull together, and at their center, a queen whose smile had since turned to stone. She had endured the king's paranoia, his outbursts, his humiliations. She had watched him punish their children for imagined slights, and now she watched the court drift from loyalty to loathing. She said nothing, but her silence gave permission. The conspirators knew direct rebellion meant annihilation. He was still powerful, still dangerous, still worshipped by many, but he was not invincible. They needed something poetic, a punishment that matched the crime. They found inspiration in ancient texts, in the Roman baths he loved, in the alchemical chambers hidden beneath the East Wing. There, beneath centuries of stone and sulfur, they rediscovered an old execution device, never used in their time, but whispered of in darker ages. A great cauldron, iron, deep, designed to hold the body upright, designed to boil. Not fast, not immediate, but slowly, horrifically. The plan required timing, manipulation, and most of all, spectacle. The king, after all, loved public punishments. He believed fear was power, so the court would give him a stage, and he would walk right into it. The queen gave her approval with a nod at dinner. Nothing more. A poisoned wine might have been kinder, a dagger swifter, but they didn't want swift. They wanted memory. Because this wasn't just about removing a tyrant. This was about erasing him with a story so grotesque, no one would ever rule like him again. The plot was no longer just survival. It was revenge, ritualized, and the water was already warming. The day arrived like any other in the court, but beneath the gilded calm, hearts raced. The hall had been prepared, vast, echoing, laced with incense and false celebration. Banners hung heavy from the ceiling, musicians played trembling notes. The nobles lined the walls, dressed in their finest, faces powdered, smiles rehearsed, eyes watchful. At the center stood the cauldron, massive, black, ancien, tea polished until it gleamed. It sat above a roaring fire, hidden beneath ornate grates. The steam that curled from its lip carried the scent of herbs, of burning oil, and something darker. The king entered in full regalia, golden crown catching the candlelight, robes trailing like blood behind him. He thought he was attending a trial of a traitor supposedly found in the court. Another opportunity to display strength. Another moment to burn fear into their eyes. But no prisoner awaited him. Only the throne beside the cauldron. The queen stepped forward, offering him a ceremonial goblet, a pretext. He drank, the taste of honey and wine, sweet, deceptive. Then came the reading of charges. Fabricated, strange, they named him. In cold, deliberate words, the court declared the king a danger to the realm. The silence that followed was thunderous. He laughed at first, called it theater, called them mad. Until his guards, moved behind him, until the queen stepped back, gaze unblinking, until they seized him. He screamed, not in pain, not yet, but in disbelief. How could they? He was divine, chosen, untouchable. His voice cracked with rage. He threatened hell itself. No one moved. They stripped him of his cloak, tore the scepter from his fist, and then, limb by limb, they lowered him in. The first touch of water drew a howl so primal, the walls themselves seemed to flinch. Steam rose like spirits. The musicians stopped. A single scream echoed, long and ragged, then again, then again. Each one less human, more animal. His skin blistered, peeled, his voice became gurgled gasps. The nobles watched. Some turned away. Others didn't. No one spoke. Not even when the bubbling stopped. Not even when the smell filled their lungs. When it was over, the hall stood in a sacred hush. Not victory, not relief, just a heavy, lingering dread. Because they had killed a king, not with a blade, Betos, but with his own methods. And in doing so, they had become what they once feared. The throne still stood, but no one dared sit. The next morning, the palace was quieter than it had ever been. No proclamations were read, no bells tolled for morning. The cauldron was removed before dawn, scrubbed by trembling hands, its blackened interior still holding the memory of a scream. Ashes were swept, blood-stained tapestries burned, and every trace of what had happened was erased, at least on the surface. The courtiers returned to their routines with a haunting precision. They bowed, whispered, performed rituals of loyalty, but something fundamental had changed. The fear that once bound them had curdled into guilt, silence, and a collective understanding no one dared to speak aloud. The queen, once silent in his shadow, now sat on the throne, not with triumph, but with hollow eyes and a voice that cracked from the weight of memory. She had orchestrated the fall, yet gained no peace. Her nights were haunted by steam, by blistered skin, by a crown that seemed heavier than ever before. Whispers began in the outer villages, of a king boiled alive by his own court, of betrayal dressed in velvet, of power that turned inward and devoured itself. The royal scribes wrote carefully revised accounts. The king had died of illness, a peaceful passing, surrounded by loyal subjects. But servants knew better. They passed the tale down in shadows, behind closed doors, of how justice boiled in a pot, and how silence was the only shield left when the flames had burned too long. The man who ruled by terror became a myth soaked in horror, not a martyr, not a legend, just a memory scorched into stone. Years later, no monument stood in his name. No songs were sung of his glory. Only the cauldron remained, hidden deep in the vaults beneath the palace, cold and empty. A relic of the day the throne itself turned on its master. And though no one dared speak it aloud, all who lived through it carried the same lesson deep into their bones. Sometimes the crown doesn't fall, it melts. The fire died long ago. The stones of the palace cooled, but the memory of what happened in that chamber never left. This was no rebellion, no noble uprising. It was a slow suffocation, the kind bred by silence, by centuries of kneeling, by too many bowed heads and unspoken truths. The king had ruled like a god, demanded worship, demanded fear, and in doing so, became something less than human. A monster. His throne outlived him. His name, once whispered with trembling reverence, now echoes only in dread. No statues bear his face, no children are named in his honor. All that remains is the tale of the day a monarch was turned to steam in front of his own court, and no one stopped it. But the ending was no liberation. Those who stayed, the nobles, the servants, the advisors, were not free. They were witnesses, complicit, bound now not by his laws, but by the horror of what they'd allowed, what they'd watched. In silencing the monster, they became prisoners of their own quiet. The queen who replaced him never smiled. The halls never felt warm again. The cauldron, once a tool of punishment, became a relic of shame, locked away beneath the castle where no sunlight touched. And so the question lingers like smoke. When kings become monsters, who truly suffers? Not just the victims, not just the court, but the legacy itself, scorched, buried, blackened. A crown melted not by rebellion, but by its own fire. History doesn't speak his name loudly anymore, but it remembers, quietly, reluctantly. Because in the end, it wasn't justice. It wasn't triumph. It was warning. The kind carved not in marble, but in fear. And still, in the stillest corners of that ancient palace, the scent of smoke remains, faint, bitter, eternal.